The Ozark hills are still in October. Cold comes early. Here settles into the valleys before the leaves are done falling, and the lake below sits flat and dark like something that has swallowed a whole world and kept quiet about it. A gravel lane cuts through cedar and oak toward a small white farmhouse on a ridge above the water. The porch sags slightly at the center. Paint lifts from the siding in long, curling strips. From a distance, the place looks abandoned. It is not abandoned. Inside every shelf, every windowsill, every square foot of floor holds a tin. Dozens of them, hundreds, each one sealed. Each one labeled in the same careful handwriting. One tin is smaller than the rest, set apart. Its label does not name a plant or a season. It names a family. Somewhere on the highway south of Springfield, a woman is driving toward this house with a suitcase she packed in 14 minutes and nowhere else to go. And somewhere closer, a car is already slowing at the mailbox. The morning Maren Hollis turned 63, she woke up in a church parking lot with a stranger's hand on her car window. Not a threat, just a tap, the kind you give someone you are worried about. She had forgotten for one long second where she was. Then it came back. The vinyl seat. The coat she had been using as a blanket. The suitcase in the back seat she had packed in 14 minutes while Douglas stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, watching her the way a man watches movers carrying furniture out of a house he no longer wants. Subscribe and stay with Maren. Because what she found at the end of that drive was not just an old farmhouse. It was a secret someone had spent 50 years protecting. And the first tin box she opened would change everything she thought she understood about the people she came from. The man outside her window was in his 70s, wearing a gray cardigan and holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands. He was not threatening. He was simply a pastor who had come to unlock his church at 6 in the morning and found a woman sleeping in the lot like she had nowhere else to be, because she didn't. She rolled the window down an inch. "I've got coffee inside if you need it." That was all he said. No questions, no look that made her feel small. He set the paper cup on her roof, patted the door frame once, and walked toward the church entrance without glancing back. Maren sat with her hands in her lap for a long moment. The cup steamed softly in the October air. Outside Springfield, Missouri, was beginning its morning the way it always did. School buses, gas stations, opening men in reflective vests standing beside road equipment, drinking from thermoses. The world running on, as though nothing had happened, as though a woman had not just been handed a divorce agreement and a prepared checklist of her own belongings sorted and annotated in her husband's handwriting. She reached for the coffee. It tasted like burnt grounds and lukewarm water. It was the best thing she had drunk in 3 days. 37 years is not a short time to misunderstand a person. Maren had not misunderstood Douglas Hollis all at once. It happened the way water lines rise slowly. Then one morning you look down and realize the floor is wet. He was not a man who shouted. He did not leave marks. What Douglas did was quieter and, in its own way, more complete. He handled things. He handled the finances because he was better with numbers. He handled the taxes because the forms were complicated. He handled the insurance, the investment accounts, the repairs, the service calls, the decisions about which neighborhood they would live in and which car made more sense and which of Maren's colleagues were, in his words, not really her kind of people. He handled the phone call from her Aunt Cora once in 2011 when Maren was grading papers at the kitchen table and Douglas picked up before she could reach it. She heard him say, "She's busy, Cora. You know how she gets when she's working." She had not been busy. She had been 3 feet away, but by the time she looked up, he had already hung up, and he was smiling the small, competent smile of a man who had just taken care of something. "She says hello," he told her. Maren believed him. That was the thing she could not explain to people later when she tried. How do you explain trusting someone so completely that you stop checking? How do you explain that trust when it lasts long enough, begins to feel like the floor beneath your feet, something you stop noticing because it has never given way before? She had been a third-grade teacher for 11 years before Douglas suggested gently that the commute was wearing her out, that they didn't need the income, that she deserved to rest. She had rested for 26 years. And when the school where she used to teach called in 2019 looking for part-time reading support, Douglas found the voicemail first. He did not delete it. He simply said, "They're looking for someone younger, I think. More digital experience. I didn't want you to bother going through the whole thing." She had not asked to hear the message herself. That was how it worked, not with locks or commands, with management, with reasonable-sounding explanations that arrived just before she thought to ask questions. Until the morning of her 63rd birthday, when she came downstairs to find a manila envelope beside the coffee maker and Douglas already dressed for the office, his briefcase by the door. "I've had this looked over by 2 attorneys," he said. "It's fair. The account in the second paragraph is yours to keep. I've already moved it." He said it the way he said everything measured inevitable, like a clause in an agreement she had signed years ago and simply forgotten. She did not cry. She stood at the kitchen counter and read the document 3 times while the coffee maker hissed and Douglas checked his phone. The numbers were clean, the language was clean, the smaller account he was giving her had enough for 6 months of modest living, exactly as described. She looked up. "Where am I supposed to go?" "That's not something I can determine for you, Maren." He picked up his briefcase and left. She thought of her sister in Tulsa. Her sister's husband, who had Douglas's same way of making her feel like a guest in a room she was expected to vacate. She thought of a hotel, but the math was wrong, and the math had always frightened her, because Douglas had handled the numbers so long that her own hands felt clumsy around them. And then sitting in that church parking lot at 6 in the morning with a cup of bad coffee going cold on her roof, she thought of Aunt Cora, Cora Slade, her mother's younger sister, who had lived alone on a small farm south of Branson for as long as Maren could remember, on a ridge above Table Rock Lake, where the hills turned copper in October and the water below ran colors that had no name in the afternoon light. Maren had not been to the farm in 11 years. She had stopped going after Douglas mentioned twice that the drive was too long, and Cora had a way of filling Maren's head with what he called old stories. He never forbade her. He simply made the visits seem like indulgences that reasonable women eventually outgrew. Cora had died in June, 4 months ago. Maren had attended the funeral in a car with Douglas and cried quietly while he kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other resting near the gear shift close enough to her knee that it looked like comfort but never quite touched. She had received a card from a law office 2 weeks after the funeral, something about the estate. Douglas had set it on his desk and said he would handle it. Now, sitting in the parking lot, Maren reached into the glove compartment where she had put the important papers, the ones she had grabbed in those 14 minutes, the ones she had chosen without thinking clearly, running on instinct and the low animal knowledge that she needed documents in her own name. Among them was a small envelope she had almost left behind. It had her name on the front in a typeface from a law office in Forsyth, Missouri, and it had already been opened. Douglas had opened it. Of course he had. Inside was a single-page letter and paper-clipped to the back, a key on a simple ring with a handwritten tag. The letter informed Maren that her aunt, Cora Ann Slade, had named her the sole heir to the property at Route 7 Table Rock, Missouri. The farm, the house, the land running down to the tree line above the water. Everything, not divided among family, not placed in a trust, not left to the church or the historical society or any of the other places Cora had been known to send small checks over the years. Just Maren. She read the letter twice, then looked up through the windshield at the pale October sky. Douglas had received this letter before she ever saw it. He had known about the farm for 4 months, and he had said nothing. The drive south took just over 2 hours. Maren did not listen to music. She drove with the windows cracked and the heater running low, and she watched Missouri move past her in the particular way of October, the way the light came sideways through stripped cornfields, the way the roadside grass had gone the color of old paper, the way smoke from distant burn piles rose in thin white lines against a sky that could not quite decide between gray and blue. She had not called ahead. There was no one to call. The turnoff for the farm was marked by a mailbox she almost missed, painted years ago in red and white, now faded to rust and cream. The gravel lane ran about a quarter-mile through cedar and oak opening, finally onto a flat yard, where the farmhouse sat in the middle distance, looking smaller than she remembered, and somehow more dignified. It was a wood-frame house, 1 story with a wide porch running the full front length. The roof was sound, she checked, that first looking for the sag that would mean water damage. The porch boards were weathered but mostly straight. A window on the east side had a crack in the upper corner, taped from inside with what looked like electrical tape, the temporary fix of a woman who had planned to get to it eventually. The yard was overgrown, the flower beds had gone wild and seedy, and the garden plot behind the house was a tangle of spent vines and brown stalks. But the gate latch worked when Maren tried it, and the front path was clear, and the air coming off the hillside above the lake smelled of leaf smoke and cold water and something faintly sweet she could not name. She sat in the car for a while, with both hands on the wheel, looking at the house. A crow landed on the porch railing, considered her, and flew off toward the tree line. She got out. The key fit. It turned on the first try, no sticking, as though the lock had been oiled recently, or as though it had been waiting. The door opened onto a hallway that smelled of cedar and lavender and the particular dry sweetness of a house where someone has lived quietly for a very long time. Maren stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The house was small and orderly in the way of people who have thought carefully about how to live in a small space. A braided rug, a straight-backed chair by the door, framed photographs on the plaster wall, most of them faded to soft brown tones, faces she recognized, and some she did not. And on every available surface, the windowsills, the kitchen shelves, the narrow ledge above the fireplace, the wooden crates, stacked too deep along the hallway wall were tins, dozens of them. Old biscuit tins, shortbread tins, tobacco tins, tea caddies, cookie tins, from holidays long past. Some were rusted at the corners. Some were pristine, their printed images still vivid, holly branches, winter scenes, a spaniel in a field. Each one had a small strip of masking tape on the lid with something written on it in Cora's careful hand. Garden Seed, 1998. Hollyhock saved. Tomato Mortgage Lifter. Cherokee Trail of Tears. Bean do not open. Maren moved down the hall, slowly reading the labels the way you read headstones. Not morbid, attentive. She had forgotten this about Cora, how she saved things, how she treated even ordinary objects as though they contained something worth keeping, as though the world was always in the process of losing things it would later need, and someone had to pay attention. Douglas had called it hoarding once. The one time he came to the farm 12 years ago, standing in this same hallway, with his eyes moving across the tins, with the look of a man calculating the cost of a dumpster. "She'll need help clearing this out, eventually," he said, not meaning it as cruelty, just meaning it as fact. Maren had not corrected him. She had only looked at the tins and felt something she could not name, a low, warm pull, like recognition. She felt it again now, standing in the afternoon light, with her suitcase at her feet. The bedroom at the back of the house was Cora's, and Maren felt the strangeness of stepping into it without permission before she remembered that permission had been formally legally granted. The room was plain and clean, an iron bed with a quilt in a double wedding ring pattern, a cedar chest beneath the window, its top surface clear, except for a small cactus in a terracotta pot that had somehow survived 4 months unwatered, reduced to a wizened stub of itself, but still unmistakably alive. Maren touched it with one finger, still alive. She opened the cedar chest. Inside were more quilts, folded with the precision of a woman who respected fabric, and beneath them a faint drift of dried lavender from sachets that had long since lost their shape. She lifted one quilt and pressed it to her face, the way you press something when you're trying to bring a person back. Cedar, lavender, something like sunlight that had been trapped in cloth for years. She sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the afternoon light was moving off the hillside, and the lake below was catching it, sending up long broken flashes through the tree line. The house settled once around her, a low wooden exhale, the sound of old timber adjusting to the cold. She had not been held so gently by a building since she was a child. She thought she might stay one night, just to have a roof over her head that no one could take before morning. She did not see the tin on the floor near the bedroom door until she stood to look for sheets. It was smaller than the ones in the hallway, and it set apart from the furniture, with the deliberate placement of an object that had been set down with intention, not forgotten, placed. The label on the lid was not the usual masking tape strip. It was a square of white cardstock fastened with a dab of dried glue, and on it, in Cora's blue ballpoint, 4 words that were not about seeds at all. Do not open yet. Below that, in smaller letters, sleep first. You'll know when. Maren stood looking at it for a long time. She looked at the tin, then at the window, then at the suitcase still leaning against the wall. She thought about Douglas opening her mail, about the key sitting in the envelope for 4 months while he said nothing, about the word handled and all the shapes it could take when someone decided you did not need to know your own business. She left the tin where it was. She made up the bed, ate half a sleeve of crackers she found in the kitchen cabinet, and lay down in her great-aunt's quilt with the October dark pressing at the windows. She did not expect to sleep. She was gone in 4 minutes. She woke once in the small hours to the sound of tires on gravel, not pulling in, passing slow, the crunch and pause of a vehicle that was looking at something before deciding to keep moving. By the time she reached the window, there was nothing on the lane but dark. No headlights, no shape in the trees, only the lake below catching the last of a rising moon and the distant sound of water moving over the dam spillway 3 miles south, low and constant as a breath. She stood at the window for a long time before going back to bed. In the morning, she opened the tin. It was lined with a folded piece of cloth, the kind Cora used for quilting scraps, soft cotton in a faded blue check. Sitting inside the cloth, arranged with the same care Cora gave to everything she preserved, were 3 things. A small stack of photographs bound with a rubber band that crumbled when Maren touched it, a folded piece of notebook paper, the kind with thin blue lines, and a red margin covered in Cora's writing. and beneath both of those, nestled against the cloth, like something sleeping, a second tin, smaller still, barely the size of a deck of cards, its label reading Beaumont Family. Bean seed, 1957. Keep dry. Maren set the small tin aside carefully and unfolded the notebook paper. She recognized Cora's handwriting. She had seen it on birthday cards and recipe cards and the tags on the other tins in the hall. But this was different from all of those. This was Cora writing fast, the letters slanting more than usual, some words pressed harder into the page, as though the pen needed the emphasis. Maren, a man named Garrett Pell, has come to the house 3 times since February. He wants the land, not the house, he said, as much the second time, which tells you what kind of man he is. The first time he was polite. The second time he mentioned tax complications in a way that was not a question. The third time he said that if I wasn't in a position to handle the property myself, my family would have to deal with the problems after I was gone. I told him my family would be fine. He smiled the way people smile when they believe you don't understand your own situation. I understood my situation perfectly. I just didn't tell him what it was. There are boxes in the back room and in the root cellar and in the chest in the second bedroom. Don't let anyone take them before you understand what they are. Don't sign anything about the land before you talk to someone who isn't connected to Douglas. I know you don't know what I mean by that yet. You will. I would have told you all of this in person, but I didn't know how much time I had, and your phone was always answered by someone else. The bean seed is the Beaumont family's. They grew it on the land where the east finger of the lake is now, before the dam. Don't plant it until you're ready to stay. I love you. I kept the farm because I knew you would need it. I kept the other things because other people needed someone too. Come when you're ready, or come when you have nowhere else to go. Either way, the door opens. Cora Maren sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she finished reading. The morning light was coming through the east window over the sink, falling across the table in a long angled bar that moved almost imperceptibly as the sun climbed. Outside, the cedar trees at the yard's edge were moving slightly in a wind she could not yet hear inside the house. She thought about Douglas saying he would handle the estate paperwork. She thought about the phone in 2011. She's busy. She thought about Garrett Pell polite the first time. She thought about the small tin with the bean seed and the year 1957 pressed into its label in ink that had not faded. Then she stood, filled the kettle from the tap, and set it on the stove burner. There were boxes in the back room and in the root cellar. There was a second bedroom. There was a man who had come to this house 3 times to get something, and he had not gotten it. And somewhere in a law office in Springfield, a divorce agreement was still unsigned. Maren watched the kettle and waited for the water to boil. Across the room on the windowsill, a row of seed tins sat in the morning light, patient closed, holding what they held, waiting, as they had always waited for the right season. Words 3098, twists 2, hooks 4, quote-worthy 6. The boxes in the back room were stacked floor to ceiling. along 3 walls, and Maren stood in the doorway the first morning, looking at them the way you look at a task that has no obvious beginning. She chose the nearest one. It was heavier than it looked. She miscalculated, lifted wrong, and the bottom corner caught the door frame as she tried to maneuver it to the kitchen table. A thin crack ran up one side. She set it down, breathed through her teeth, and opened it where it sat on the floor. Inside were paper grocery bags, folded over their contents, each one labeled in pencil on the front. She lifted the first bag carefully and unfolded it on the floor around her. Church bulletins. Dozens of them spanning decades, from a congregation called Mount Zion AME, the dates running from 1941 to 1987. Each bulletin had names printed inside, committee members, choir rosters, prayer requests, announcements of births and deaths, and homecomings. And on many of them, in pencil so light you had to angle the paper toward the window to see it, Cora had added small notations in the margins. Moved to Kansas City, 1953, 3 children, brother killed in mine accident, 1948. No record found at courthouse. This is Della Freeman's handwriting. She was secretary here for 30 years. Maren sat cross-legged on the back room floor for 2 hours. She was not efficient. She did not have a system. She kept stopping to read things that were not strictly speaking necessary to read in order to understand what she was holding. A prayer request from 1962 for a family whose house had burned. An announcement from 1955 celebrating a young man's acceptance to a college in Ohio. A bulletin from 1971 with a photograph of the choir, 12 people standing in 2 rows, faces clear and serious. Somebody's grandmother in the back row wearing a hat with a silk flower. She set each thing down more carefully than she had picked it up. By noon she had gone through 2 bags and made a list of names in the back of a small notebook she found in Cora's kitchen drawer. Her handwriting was shaky, in the way of someone who has not written by hand with any purpose for a long time. She looked at the list. 41 names, 2 bags, 1 box. There were at least 30 boxes in the back room, more in the root cellar, Cora's letter had said. She made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and did not let herself think about the full number. She drove into the nearest town that afternoon, Ridgemont, 11 miles north on the state highway, population just under 4,000. She needed grocery staples, and she needed, though she would not have phrased it this way yet, to be around other people for an hour, to confirm that the world outside the farm was still running on ordinary time. The hardware store on the main street had archival supplies in a dusty back section, acid-free folders, a box of cotton gloves, 2 sizes of clear sleeves. The woman at the counter, who was somewhere in her 60s and wore her silver hair in a braid over one shoulder, looked at the items Maren set on the counter and then looked at Maren. "You're working with old paper." "I'm trying to." "Cora Slade's place." Maren looked up. The woman's expression was not surprised. It was more like someone confirming a direction they had already guessed. "She came in for the same things every few years. I'm Odalis. I live on the county road about a mile past your turnoff." She folded the sleeves into a paper bag with the practiced ease of someone who has been wrapping things carefully her entire life. I wondered when somebody would come. She did not ask more questions. She did not offer her phone number or suggest she stop by. She only said as Maren picked up the bag, "The root cellar has a loose latch on the left side. You have to lift and turn at the same time or the door won't hold open." Then she turned back to her register. Maren stood at the counter for a moment, bag in hand, with the particular feeling of someone who has just been told they are not as alone as they believed. She said, "Thank you." Odalis nodded once already, helping the next customer. The root cellar was accessed through a slanted wooden door set into the hillside behind the house just below the garden plot. Odalis was right about the latch lift and turn, and the door swung open onto stone steps descending into cool dark that smelled of earth and old wood and something metallic that might have been the shelving. Maren used her phone's flashlight until she found the pull chain for the bare bulb overhead. The root cellar was smaller than the back room, but denser. The shelves along both walls held mason jars going back decades, preserved green beans, tomatoes, apple butter, the lids of some starting to rust. But on the floor, lined up in two careful rows, with a narrow path between them, were more boxes. These were different from the ones upstairs. They were sealed with brown packing tape and labeled, not in pencil, but in Cora's blue ballpoint, the same ink as the letter. Table Rock Relocation, 1956 to 1959, Beaumont, Freeman, Giddings, Pryor, Washington. Land records copies only. Originals at courthouse uncertain. Do not discard. Maren crouched in front of the nearest box and read the label 3 times. Table Rock Relocation. She knew in the loose way of someone who has lived her whole life near a thing without examining it, that Table Rock Lake had been created by a dam, that it had flooded a valley, that towns and farms had been moved. She had known this the way you know that roads were built on something and fields were cleared from something abstractly without faces attached. These boxes had faces attached. She lifted one carefully and carried it up the stone steps into the thin afternoon light. She did not open it that day. Instead, she drove to the Ridgemont Public Library, which was housed in a low brick building on the east end of town, with a wheelchair ramp installed so recently the concrete was still clean at the edges. The librarian at the reference desk was a man in his early 50s, compact and deliberate in his movements, with a name badge that read T. Birdsong, and a way of looking up from whatever he was reading that suggested he had been expecting an interruption and was prepared to take it seriously. "I'm looking for information about the Table Rock Dam relocation, 1956 to 1959. He closed his book. "How much do you know already?" "Almost nothing." He nodded as though this were a reasonable starting place. "Most people around here know almost nothing. That's not an accident." He came around the desk and led her to the local history section, a corner of the library with its own low shelving and two reading chairs positioned near a north-facing window. He pulled three binders from the shelf, a county atlas from 1954 and a slim, staple-bound publication from the Army Corps of Engineers that looked like it had never been opened by anyone who was not professionally required to do so. The dam created the lake in 1958, he said, setting the materials on the table between them. Before that, a valley ran through here with a river and a creek and about 200 families living along them. They were given notice and compensation and told where they could relocate. The compensation was calculated by the federal government. He paused. The families who owned the best bottomland along the river were mostly white. The families on the upper creek ground the rockier, less valuable acreage by federal standards were mostly black. The compensation rates were not the same. Maren looked at the atlas. The valley was there in the 1954 edition, clearly drawn roads, property lines, structures, marked with small squares. She found the area labeled Beaumont along a tributary above the main channel. Were there records kept of who lived where, what they were paid? Some. The courthouse has ledgers, but there are gaps. He looked at her steadily. I've been trying to fill some of those gaps for about 8 years. May I ask why you're interested? She told him about Cora, about the boxes, about the label on the tin Beaumont family, Beanseed, 1957. Theo Birdsong sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Your aunt contacted me, he said finally. About 4 years ago, we wrote letters back and forth for almost 2 years. She was building something, a record. Photographs, church documents, land descriptions, testimony from people who were still alive and remembered. She was trying to make something that couldn't be argued away. He looked back at Maren. Then the letters stopped. I wrote twice more and didn't hear back. I assumed she'd gotten too ill. She died in June. I know I saw the notice. A pause. I'm sorry. They sat for a moment with the county atlas open between them and the particular silence of a library room where something important is being understood. How much did she finish? Theo asked. I don't know yet. I've only opened a few boxes. He nodded slowly. Then we should find out. He came to the farm 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, with a canvas bag over his shoulder and the unhurried manner of someone who has learned that important work resists being rushed. He brought a portable scanner, a ream of acid-free paper, and a yellow legal pad. Maren had spent the intervening days opening boxes systematically, one at a time, contents listed, before anything was moved, the notebook filling with names and dates and the small annotations Cora had added in margins and on the backs of envelopes. She had gotten better at it, not fast. Better. Theo did not take over. That was the first thing she noticed. He looked at her notebook, asked questions about her system, and suggested 2 adjustments. One, for how she was dating undated photographs. One for how she cross-referenced family names across different boxes. Then he sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad and let her hand him things. The work found its rhythm. By mid-morning, they had cleared the Table Rock relocation boxes from the root cellar and arranged their contents across the kitchen table, the counter, and 2 card tables Maren had found folded in the back room. The scope of what Cora had assembled became visible for the first time. There were photographs, not a few, but hundreds. Families outside houses, men beside farm equipment, women in gardens, children on porches. On the back of almost every one, Cora's handwriting names, dates, locations, relationships, notes about what had been lost and where people had gone after the valley filled with water. There were letters, responses from people Cora had written to over the years in cities across the Midwest. People who had been children during the relocation and remembered. People who had parents and grandparents who never fully recovered from the move, who died without adequate compensation, whose land records simply did not appear in the county ledger in the way they should have. And there were documents, copies of plat maps, property tax records, 2 affidavits notarized at a courthouse in a neighboring county, a handwritten statement from a woman named Ruth Giddings dated 2017 that ran to 4 pages and ended, "I am telling this to Cora Slade because she is the first person in 50 years who asked me to." Theo was quiet for a long time after reading that one. "She built a case," he said, "not with wonder, with recognition. She built a historical record sufficient to put these families in the official account. If this were submitted to the State Historical Society with proper documentation, they would have to acknowledge it. Would they? He considered. They would have to decide whether to, which is different from what they have now, which is the option to simply not think about it. The first visitor came the following Thursday. His name was Wendell Pryor. He was 81 years old, and he arrived in a pickup truck that had seen 30 Missouri winters, wearing a canvas coat and a cap he removed when he stepped through the front door as though he were entering a church. Odalis had sent him. No explanation in the message he left in Maren's mailbox, just a name and a time, and he has people in the relocation boxes. Maren brought him to the kitchen table, where Theo had set out the Pryor family folder, photographs, a land record copy, a letter from Cora's correspondence file. Wendell Pryor sat down and did not speak for several minutes. Then he put his finger on one photograph. An older man standing in front of a small house wearing overalls, one hand shading his eyes against the sun. "That's my grandfather." His voice was even. He was not a man who cried easily. Maren understood. He had spent 81 years in a county where Pryor family land existed only in memory. "We were told the records were incomplete," he said. "My father tried twice at the courthouse. They were always very polite about it." He turned the photograph over and read Cora's notation on the back. His expression changed in the way that faces change when something long absent is returned, not dramatically, but in the deep muscles in the set of the jaw. "She wrote his name, right?" he said quietly. The courthouse has it wrong on the ledger, one letter different. My father always said it was wrong, and they always said they'd look into it. He sat with the photograph for a long time. When he left, he shook Maren's hand at the door and said he would ask his daughter to come. His daughter had the family Bible, and the family Bible had names going back to before the Civil War, and some of those names matched names in Cora's church bulletin files. After his truck turned out of the lane, Maren stood on the porch in the November cold. She had spent her career teaching 8-year-olds to read, teaching them that words on a page meant something, that someone had put them there deliberately, that reading carefully was a form of respect. She had never thought of that work as connected to anything else she might do. She thought of it now. The letter from Douglas's attorney arrived on a Friday. It was a thick envelope, and Maren knew before she opened it that it would be precise and would be designed to make her feel that the precision was inevitable. She was not wrong. 3 pages of careful legal language arrived at a single point because certain marital asset documents remained unsigned. The farm property at Table Rock was technically subject to contestation as a shared marital asset. She had 30 days to respond. The attorney's name was at the bottom. His office was in Springfield. He had the letterhead noted 22 years of family law experience. Maren set the letter on the kitchen table. She looked at the prior family folder, at the photographs in their sleeves, at the yellow legal pads covered in notes, at the small tin with the bean seed sitting on the windowsill where the morning light had been falling on it every day since she arrived. She went to the root cellar and got a jar of Cora's tomatoes and made soup because she needed something to do with her hands, and then she sat at the table with the soup and the letter, and she felt for the first time since arriving at the farm the particular quality of fear that is not about what has already happened, but about what might still be taken. She had no attorney. She had a small account with 6 months of modest living in it. She had a farmhouse full of other people's history, and a man in Springfield with 22 years of experience, and a client who understood how to make things seem inevitable. She did not sleep well that night. The next morning she called Theo. He came within the hour and read the letter twice, standing at the counter still in his coat. "This is a pressure tactic," he said. "Technically it has some basis, but the basis is thin. The farm was willed to you directly and unambiguously. The question is whether he can tie it up long enough to make it not worth fighting. Can he, if you don't have representation, possibly?" He set the letter down. "I know someone. She handles property disputes, mostly agricultural. She grew up in Stone County. She's not fond of developers or men who use legal language to manage their wives." Something about the way he said it, not bitterly, just factually the way you state the weather, steadied Maren more than reassurance would have. "Call her," Maren said. While Theo made the call from the porch, Maren stood at the kitchen window. The lake was visible through the tree line in November, the leaves having dropped enough to show the water, flat and gray in the morning, moving in small wind-blown lines across the surface. She thought about Cora 3 times visited by a man named Garrett Pell, 3 times politely informed that she did not understand her own situation. Cora had understood her situation perfectly. She had just not told him what it was. Wendell Pryor's daughter came on a Tuesday with the family Bible. Her name was Celestine. She was 54, and she sat across from Maren at the kitchen table with the controlled composure of a woman who had long ago decided that emotion was permitted in private and precision was required in public. She opened the Bible to the genealogy pages in the front, the pages that families used before official records existed, or when official records could not be trusted to spell your name correctly or remember you at all. The names went back to 1831. Theo matched 6 of them to names in Cora's church files. 3 matched photographs. 2 matched the affidavit from Ruth Giddings. Celestine looked at the matches without speaking. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the Bible, perfectly still. My father spent 40 years being told the records were incomplete, she said finally. What he meant was that the records of his family were considered incomplete. The records of the families who received proper compensation were apparently just fine. She looked at Maren. What happens with all of this? Maren answered honestly. I don't know the full shape of it yet, but it won't disappear. I can promise that much. Celestine Pryor nodded once. She closed the Bible and set it on the table between them. Then I'll leave this here for now. It's safer with the rest of them. She left without taking anything back. The Bible sat on the corner of the table for the rest of the day, and every time Maren passed it, she felt the weight of what it meant to be trusted with something a family had kept for nearly 200 years. The call came on a Thursday evening when the light was going fast, and the temperature had dropped enough that Maren could see her breath in the back room where she was working. It was Theo. His voice was careful in the way of someone delivering information they have verified thoroughly before speaking. I found Addie Beaumont. Maren straightened up slowly from the box she had been sorting. She's in Joplin, 71 years old, retired school teacher. A pause. She knew your aunt had contacted her family once years ago. She didn't know about the boxes. Maren looked at the Beaumont folder on the table, thick now with what Cora had assembled over decades. The photographs, the land records, the letter Cora had written and sealed and labeled for the Beaumont family in a hand that had not trembled. Does she want to meet? She said, and I'm quoting her directly, tell me when and I'll be there. 2 hours later, a car Maren did not recognize slowed at the bottom of the lane. It did not turn in. It moved at the pace of something reading an address or taking a photograph or making a note. The headlights were on but dim, and in the brief window before the car accelerated and disappeared around the curve, Maren saw the profile of a man in the driver's seat, holding a phone toward the windshield. She stood at the kitchen window until the road was empty. Then she went to the table and looked at the Beaumont folder and the Pryor folder, and the stack of legal pads and the tin with the bean seed on the windowsill, and she understood for the first time that what she had in this house was not just important to the families who came looking. It was important to someone else for a different reason. Important enough to drive past slowly in the dark. Important enough that Douglas had kept a letter for 4 months. Important enough that Garrett Pell had come 3 times to a stubborn old woman's door and smiled his patient smile and waited. Maren went to check the lock on the front door, then the back door. Then she sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee and looked at the boxes and thought about what it meant that a man in a dark car had just taken a photograph of a farmhouse full of other people's history, and what it meant that tomorrow or the day after he might stop deciding to keep driving. She did not sleep. Not because of fear exactly, though fear was present, sitting in the room with her, the way cold sits in a room, not aggressive, just there. She didn't sleep because something had clarified. The man in the dark car had done that without meaning to. He had made the stakes visible in a way that Douglas's legal letter and Garrett Pell's 3 polite visits had not quite managed. This was not a dispute about property. This was about whether the contents of this house would survive long enough to matter. Maren sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning making a list. Not of fears, of facts. The boxes existed. The documents had been copied, notarized, witnessed. Theo had the originals of several key records stored at the library under his professional custody. The Pryor family Bible was on the corner of the table. The Beaumont folder was thick and sourced and cross-referenced in Cora's hand and Theo's, and now her own. None of this could be undone by a car driving slowly past a mailbox. What could be undone was her isolation. She wrote that word in the notebook and looked at it. Isolation was the mechanism. It was how Douglas had operated for 37 years. It was how Pell had approached Cora alone, elderly, without witnesses. It was what the legal letter was designed to produce, a woman who felt too small and too uncertain to fight. Maren drew a line under the word and began writing names beneath it. Theo Birdsong, Odalis Fenn, Celestine Pryor, Wendell Pryor. The attorney Theo had called her name was Ruta Vance, and she had said she would have paperwork ready by end of week. Addie Beaumont, 90 minutes away in Joplin, who had said, "Tell me when." Below the names she wrote one more word, witnesses. Then she went to bed and slept 4 hours, which was enough. She called Ruta Vance first thing in the morning and described the car. Ruta was quiet for a moment. "Did you get a plate?" "No, it was dark." "Make and color?" "Dark sedan, recent." "I couldn't tell the make." "All right." A pause, and Maren could hear papers moving. "Here's what I want you to do. Take photographs of every document in that house. Everything. Not for quality, for proof of existence. Date stamp them with your phone. Send them to my email and to Theo's and to one more person outside the county. Do it today." "Who's the third person?" "Is there anyone Douglas doesn't know?" Maren thought. Her mind moved through years of managed friendships, the ones Douglas had found unreasonable or exhausting or not quite her kind of people. Most of them had faded. But there was one, a woman she had taught beside for 7 years before the school, before Douglas had explained the voicemail. Her name was Peg. She was retired now and living in Colombia, and she had sent Maren a Christmas card every year without fail, even the years Maren had not sent one back. "Yes," Maren said, "there's one. Send it to her." It took most of the day. Maren moved through the house methodically, back room, root cellar, kitchen table, the locked cabinet in the parlor she had found on her fourth day, and opened with a key hanging inside the grandfather clock, because Cora had trusted that the right person would think to look there. She photographed everything. Her phone storage filled twice, and she deleted old photographs of Douglas's work events to make room, which felt, she noticed, like a small ceremony. Theo arrived in the afternoon with a hard drive and a scanner, and they worked in silence for 3 hours, the scanner's lamp moving back and forth over document after document, the soft mechanical sound of it steady as a clock. Odalis came without being asked at 5 o'clock with a pot of chicken and dumplings, and the information that she had seen the dark sedan again that morning, parked at the far end of the county road for about 40 minutes before driving off toward the highway. "I wrote the plate down," she said, setting the pot on the stove and handing Maren a folded piece of paper. "I'm 82 years old, and I have nothing to do in the mornings, and my eyesight is still fine." She said it without drama, the way she said everything as plain fact, requiring no applause. Maren gave the plate number to Ruta, who called back in 2 hours. The car was registered to a property management company in Springfield. The company's listed agent was Garrett Pell. Ruta filed 2 motions the following Monday. Maren did not fully understand the legal language of either, but she understood their effect. The farm was formally flagged as contested historical property, pending state review, which meant no transaction, sale, transfer, or demolition could proceed without a hearing. The second motion requested that Douglas's claim of marital interest be assessed against the explicit language of Cora's will and the documented timeline of the estate notification, the letter he had received and not disclosed. Ruta explained it this way: "He held information that materially affected your ability to make decisions during the divorce process. That's not just bad faith. It's potentially actionable." What does that mean in plain language? It means his attorney is going to start returning my calls much faster. She was right. By Wednesday, Douglas's attorney had proposed a revised settlement. By Friday, Ruta had declined it and proposed her own. The negotiation moved with the brisk efficiency of 2 people who understood that one side's argument had developed a significant leak. Maren did not follow every exchange. She let Ruta handle it not the way she had let Douglas handle things, not from helplessness, not from the habit of making herself smaller so someone else could feel larger. She let Ruta handle it because Ruta was good at it and Maren had other work to do. That distinction, she understood now, was the entire difference. Addie Beaumont drove up from Joplin on a Saturday in late November, when the hills had gone bare and the lake was a flat silver plate below the tree line, and the air smelled of wood smoke and coming cold. She was 71 years old and moved with the deliberate ease of a woman who has decided at some point in her 60s that the world can wait for her. She wore a red coat and carried a canvas tote and shook Maren's hand at the door with a grip that said she was used to being underestimated and had long since stopped accommodating it. Theo was already at the kitchen table with the Beaumont folder open. He stood when Addie came in. She looked at him, then at the folder, then at the room, taking inventory, the way people do when they are entering a place they have needed to find for a very long time. So this is where she kept it all, Addie said. Not a question, just the settling of something long suspended. Maren brought her to the table, and they sat the three of them, and Theo opened the Beaumont folder and laid out its contents, the way you lay out something that deserves to be seen fully before it is discussed. Addie moved through the photographs slowly. A house, a garden, a man with a mule, 3 children in good clothes standing in front of a dogwood tree, a woman at a table with her hands folded, looking at the camera as though she had decided exactly how much of herself to give it. "That's my grandmother," Addie said. "Luella. She never talked about the move. My mother said she talked about it once after a few glasses of sweet tea at a church dinner in 1971, and then never again." She turned the photograph over. Cora's handwriting on the back, Luella Beaumont Nee Pryor, born 1901, moved to Joplin 1958 after relocation. Land along East Tributary, 47 acres. Compensation received $1,200. Assessed value of comparable white-owned bottomland, same year $4,800 per acre. Addie read it twice. She set the photograph down with both hands and sat very still. Outside, the wind moved through the cedar trees at the yard's edge, the low sound of it entering the house through old window frames, in the way of all old houses, as a moan so familiar it had become part of the room's silence. "My grandmother worked for wages for the rest of her life," Addie said. "She had been a landowner. She had grown food and kept cattle and built something, and then they paid her $1,200 and called it settled." She looked at Theo. "Is there enough here to put them on record officially?" "Yes," Theo said without hesitation. "What your aunt assembled is more than sufficient for a formal historical designation. The families displaced along the east tributary of Table Rock, the Beaumonts, the Pryors, the Freemans, the Giddings at minimum, can be documented in the state historical record. It won't return the land, but it will make the erasure itself a matter of public fact." Eddie was quiet for a moment. "My grandmother used to say, the worst part wasn't losing the land. It was that afterward nobody seemed to remember there had ever been anything there to lose." She looked at the photograph spread across the table, at the folder, at Maren. "Your aunt remembered." Then Maren brought out the sealed envelope. She had been carrying it in the Beaumont folder for weeks, waiting, without quite knowing she was waiting. The envelope Cora had marked for the Beaumont family, in the same blue ink as everything else, the same careful pressure, the same handwriting that said, "I mean this. I am not guessing. I know what I am leaving, and I know who it is for." Addie looked at it for a moment, before picking it up. She opened it without ceremony, the way you open something when you have stopped pretending you are not ready. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, and a small tin. The tin was the size of a matchbox. Its label read Beaumont Bean, East Tributary Garden, 1957, last harvest before water came. Addie held it in her palm and did not speak. The letter, Maren would learn later, contained Cora's apology, not on behalf of the county, not on behalf of the Army Corps of Engineers, not in the managed language of institutions that prefer their regrets, abstract and unspecific, on behalf of the Slade family, on behalf of her brother Harlan, who had notarized documents he should have refused, who had smoothed the process he should have slowed, who had told himself it was legal when he knew the difference between legal and right. Cora had known. She had been 22 years old when the valley flooded, and she had known, and she had spent 50 years doing the only thing she could do, which was to remember as accurately as possible and to keep what survived. Addie read the letter once. Then she folded it and held it against her chest with both hands, the tin still in her palm, and closed her eyes. No one spoke. The house was very quiet. The wind had settled. Somewhere outside the bird called once, a single clear note from the cedar trees, and then was gone. When Addie opened her eyes, they were dry, but changed the way eyes change when something long carried has been set down somewhere safe. She looked at the tin. "Bean seed," she said softly. She kept bean seed. She turned to Maren. "Do you have any idea how long bean seed can last if you keep it right?" "No," Maren said honestly. "Neither do I." Addie looked at the tin. "But I know where I'm going to find out." The State Historical Society accepted the submission in February. It was not a ceremony. It was a official letterhead informing Theo Birdsong and Maren Hollis that the documentation submitted on behalf of the Table Rock relocation families had been reviewed and accepted for inclusion in the formal record. The families named, Beaumont, Pryor, Freeman, Giddings, Washington, and 4 others, would be documented in the State Archive with the land descriptions, family histories, and photographic evidence Cora had spent decades assembling. Garrett Pell's resort development, which had required a clean title history for its financing, quietly withdrew its permit application 3 weeks later. Douglas signed the final divorce settlement in March. His attorney had found upon review that the marital asset argument was considerably weaker than originally assessed. Maren kept the farm. She kept the small account. She kept her name, which she had kept all along, though Douglas had had a way of making it feel like his. She called Peg in Columbia, who cried on the phone and said she always knew Maren was still in there somewhere, which was both slightly insulting and entirely true. Spring came late to the Ozarks that year. It came the way it always comes to hill country, cautiously, in increments, testing the air before committing. A week of false warmth, then a frost, then real warmth that arrived one morning and simply stayed. The cedar trees put out new tips pale green against the older dark. The lake below the tree line changed color from winter's flat gray to something blue that deepened through the day and caught the late light in long moving shapes. The garden behind the farmhouse had been tilled by a neighbor whose name Maren was still learning, a taciturn man in his 70s who had appeared one Saturday with a small tractor and asked where she wanted the rows. She had not asked him why. She had just pointed. In April, Addie came back. She drove up from Joplin on a morning when the air smelled of turned earth and something green and new that had no specific name, the smell of ground waking up after months of stillness. She wore work clothes and carried two things, a pair of gardening gloves and the small tin with the bean seed from the east tributary. Theo came. Odalis came walking the mile from her house on the county road with a stick she had cut from a cedar branch. Celestine Pryor came with her father Wendell, who moved slowly now, but moved. They stood in the garden behind the farmhouse in the April morning, with the lake shining through the tree line below them, and the hills going green on all sides, the sky very blue and very wide in the way of spring skies that seemed to be apologizing for how long they made you wait. Addie opened the tin. Inside, the seeds were small and dark and unremarkable looking, the kind of thing you could hold in one palm and lose against the dark countertop. 67 years since the last harvest. 67 years in a tin on Cora's shelf, through droughts and winters, and the slow turning of decades in which the land they came from had been under water, and the family that grew them had been scattered, and the record of their ownership had been for a long time incomplete. Addie handed the first seed to Wendell Pryor. He held it for a moment, this old man who had spent 40 years being told the records were incomplete. Then he bent slowly and pressed it into the turned earth with one finger. No one said anything about what it meant. They didn't need to. The morning said it for them. The light coming sideways through the cedar trees, the lake below, catching it and breaking it into long pieces. The smell of the earth just opened the small gathered group of people who had each in their own way been told at some point that what they were holding was not worth keeping. Maren planted seeds beside Addie, her hands in the dirt, her knees on the ground, the April sun warm on the back of her neck in a way that felt like something being returned. When the row was done, she sat back on her heels and looked at the turned earth. She thought about Cora at 22, watching a valley fill with water, and understanding for the first time that the world could simply decide to go on without certain people's names in the story. She thought about 50 years of teens on shelves, 50 years of writing names in margins, 50 years of keeping what others had decided was finished. She thought about a woman who had known perhaps that she would not live long enough to plant the seeds herself, and had kept them anyway. The farmhouse behind her settled in the morning warmth, a low, slow sound, the sound of old timber in good weather, the sound of a building that has stopped holding its breath. On the kitchen windowsill inside the row of seed tins caught the light through the glass. Hollyhock, Cherokee Trail of Tears Bean. mortgage lifter tomato, seed for every season Cora had lived through, kept against the possibility of a season she would not. And in the garden, in the April ground, 67 years of waiting pressed 1 inch into the Missouri soil. Not dead, never dead, only waiting for someone to understand that keeping a thing safe is itself a form of faith, that the right season will come, that the right hands will find it, that what looks finished is sometimes only resting. Maren brushed the dirt from her palms and looked at the row of small mounds in the earth, and then at Addie kneeling beside her, and at Odalis leaning on her cedar stick with her face tipped toward the sun, and at Wendell Pryor standing at the end of the row with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on the ground where he had pressed the first seed. The lake below moved in long, slow lines. A red-tailed hawk crossed the sky from west to east and did not look down. The morning held. That evening Maren sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open in front of her. The legal pads were stacked neatly to one side. The folders were filed. The Prior Bible was still in its corner, waiting for Celestine to decide it was time to take it home, or perhaps deciding for itself that it had found the right room to stay in for a while longer. She uncapped a pen. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote Slade Farm Community Archive, Table Rock, Missouri, established in the memory of Cora Ann Slade, who understood that forgetting is not something that happens to us. It is something we allow. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line beneath it, smaller, in the margin where Cora always put her private notations. Nothing kept with care is ever entirely lost. She closed the notebook. Outside, the April dark was settling over the hills, and the lake had gone the color of pewter in the last of the light. Somewhere down the county road, a dog was barking at something only it could hear. The cedar trees were black shapes against a sky that had not quite decided to become night. The farmhouse was warm, the seed tins were on the window sill, the garden was turned and planted and waiting. Maren made tea and sat with it at the table and did not feel alone. If this story stayed with you, if you have ever held something that other people called worthless and known quietly that they were wrong, tell us in the comments. Is there something in your family's history that almost disappeared, something that was saved because one person refused to let it go? We would like to know what it was.